Hello, welcome back to Book and Page. We are coming towards the end of All Quiet on the Western Front. We are on chapter 10 today. So, as usual, we'll start with a summary of what happened and then talk things over a little more. So, Paul and his friends get a good job. They're actually required to guard a village that's been abandoned that is a spot for a supply dump that is in the process of also being abandoned because shells are landing in the area. It's not safe. Well, the boys use the supply dump and the abandoned village to their benefit. They actually collect quite a bit, so they have a lovely feast that results in some very good food and also some major diarrhea. Whoops. Food comes at a price. Eventually they do have to leave the village fully when they are bombarded directly. And they actually take a bed, 2 chairs, and a cat with them. They are quite enjoying themselves on this trip. Everything seems to be going well. That is until they come across another village that is in the process of being abandoned, and they're not quite as careful because they assume that the French will not fire on their own citizens. This turns out to be somewhat untrue when they start being bombarded, and Paul and Comte actually have to flee together. Unfortunately, they are both wounded, Comte fairly badly right above the knee, and Paul is able to get them into an ambulance and off to the dressing station. At the dressing station, Paul has some shell removed from his leg wound, proves himself to be a good man at holding still as long as he doesn't think the doctor's about to cut his leg off for no good reason. And, in fact, they bribe a soldier to get them onto the same car of the hospital train arriving. Turns out having some extra cigars around is really helpful. They do get on that train. It's very clean. The women there are very nice and not afraid to help them go to the washroom as they need to. But unfortunately, Comte is not doing well. He actually starts developing a fever, and Paul ends up faking his own fever when he finds out Comte is going to be removed at the next stop on the train. So in doing this, he gets removed with Comte into another hospital, a Catholic hospital, in fact, where it turns out the soldiers and the nuns don't always get along. They have different opinions on things. The soldiers just want to sleep, but the nuns, of course, want to pray, and pray loudly, because they're praying for the soldiers as well as themselves. There is a lot of death, destruction. Comte, unfortunately, loses his leg while Paul is healing, and then towards the end of the chapter, one of the soldiers' wives comes to visit, and the entire room actually teams up to allow them a little fun time, despite the full room being there. Good on you, bros. The very end of the chapter finishes with Paul having to say goodbye to Comte, get shipped home, having to say goodbye to his mother again, and getting shipped back to the second company. Bet he was hoping that was the end of it, huh? Not quite. We still have 2 more chapters to go. So, this is a very interesting chapter because, again, we're starting to get those incongruent moments just smushed together in the same chapter. It's less divided up now simply because it's becoming impossible in a lot of ways to divide all of these happenings up into bits and pieces. It doesn't mean that Paul in his head certainly doesn't try, and it doesn't mean they don't take advantage when they have it good. It's very interesting to have the start of this chapter, because all of those reservations we might have had about Kat being able to find food in the worst places, that all gets thrown out the window. We are explicitly told that this village is abandoned, so, I mean, no one's going to be using that stuff. In fact, the way Paul says is it's all going to get shot to pieces very soon. They don't even have any real qualms about digging into the supply dump simply because most of it isn't going to be removed in time. Why not? They use it instead of, again, either it getting shot a bunch or the enemy taking advantage of it. It's sort of like the self-help version of the scorched earth policy. If we just take everything with us, nobody else has to use it. Especially not against us, right? But it's this really weird combination that starts with food. That is their primary focus for the most part. Except comfort is thrown in there. They're guarding the supply depot, so they're actually relatively safe that they've got food. So they start filling their bunker up with mattresses and blankets. They are using this easy job to their advantage, despite all the harrowing stuff they've gone through. It kind of looks more like they're having a big sleepover than fighting in a war in this moment. But there's holes, right? Legitimately, there are points in this, say, fun time of the chapter at the beginning where you get the idea that, no, we're not safe. Like, they're cooking the food, they're not being super careful, and observation balloons have spotted the smoke. So they start getting bombed. And they're actually, like, still cooking as they're being bombed. These are men who are used to being under fire and are just like, well, gotta hurry with these pancakes, I guess. It's this weird thing that I don't think we, with the distance, are going to be looking at like, no, that's completely normal. These people are used to being under fire. If you want to take advantage of any opportunity you're given, you have to be able to keep hold of that even when things turn nasty. So the fact that Paul is able to keep cooking potato pancakes as they're being fired upon, that he's able to run those pancakes through an open bombardment into their dugout without dropping any of them, that's impressive. That is like a bomb-proof man, as I say, a bomb-proof horse, somebody who is used to loud noises and the earth shaking and is just dealing with it, focusing on the thing that is going to help them in that moment, which is throwing themselves a party. Like, there is no other way of explaining this grand feast other than effectively throwing themselves a party. And it's one of those self-care moments that nobody else is going to do this for them. Like that whole Kaiser visit that we had, none of that was for them. That was for the political machine that is running the war. Even the Iron Crosses, I think a lot of these soldiers would argue, was not for them. That was so that the political machine could feel good about where they are in the war. This moment of collecting comfortable things, collecting a bunch of food, ignoring the bombs outside, bringing some other people in as guests, and sitting down and eating a really good meal, that's for them, and they have to implement that. And that's one of the interesting things, because you could see that they're willing to open the doors to other people. They don't refuse the cablemen who end up coming in. They welcome them, they join the feast. Later, when the depot is sort of being raided by their own people, they're just like, you know what, let's trade some things. It's all getting shot to pieces if we don't do it anyway, so like, go ahead, guys. They're not completely selfish, but they are rewarding themselves when they get the chance for having gotten this far. But it turns out, like, super extravagant in a really weird way when they actually load, like, an entire bed onto a truck, 2 chairs onto that bed, and then they've got the cat, like, in a cage. They've rescued the cat, they've taken the cat with them. And that's the one that makes sense to me, right? I'm not sure I could justify taking a bed and chairs, but connection to other living things is a completely natural human aspect. We are herd animals. We naturally are social and we get together in groups, and we're one of those weird animals that, like, groups up with different types of animals. Like, it's really weird that we have this relationship with cats and dogs and birds and farm animals and work animals and all of these things that, like, yeah, I have this animal that lives in my house and I feed and take care of and enjoy its company, even though it doesn't give anything back to me, right? Like, I'm not going to eat my cat at any point. The cat doesn't provide me milk or eggs or anything like that. But it provides me comfort and socialization. So this moment where the cat appears and they just take the cat with them, well, that's a human nature thing. A soft, fuzzy animal that purrs is really nice to have when you're just having a normal bad day where you got caught in traffic. That can really help again when you're experiencing the worst of the worst. Good food, fuzzy animal to cuddle, good friends. You can ignore the bombing happening outside. And the fact that they found the pigs and they found the cat gives you a sense that life, just like those birds and butterflies mentioned previously, continues on despite the war. And then it all goes wrong. And it starts kind of going wrong when they all get the shits from eating too much rich food too quickly. That gives you a sense of just how long they've actually been suffering. Like, their stomachs can't handle this sudden influx of good rich food. And then it goes along so much worse. Because it's this moment where this self-reward, which hasn't been incoming from the system itself, leads them to be not paying attention enough. That herd nature, that social nature to humanity, leads them to let their guard down, specifically because they assume that the French would not fire on their own citizens. But what they've been forgetting is that we've been told that the British are also part of this frontline assault. It's not purely a French line. So there's no guarantee that they're purely fighting Frenchmen. And there's no guarantee that in that push to win the war, no matter what, that people aren't going to go to the extremes and bomb their own people. There's no guarantee the French are even aware there's still French citizens there. But Paul and his friends see these people, and recognizing human nature as a social nature, says to themselves, it's fine. We don't have to worry about bombardment because there are French citizens here. And that should make us uncomfortable, not on Paul and his friend's side, but on being fired upon anyways. Because that gives you the sense of when you are in a wartime situation, that us versus them mentality gets narrower and narrower. And this is true about this mentality when you act upon it. You start with really broad groups, but the system of us versus them constantly requires an enemy. And if you are actually wiping out the enemies that you're identifying, then you constantly need new enemies. So it gets narrower and narrower. So in wartime like this, what is to stop you from thinking, to protect the people in my front line right now, my soldiers, I need to bomb the people over there, which includes French citizens. Like, that is how that mentality works. What sacrifices do you need to make to other groups that are not your own in order to make sure that you win this war? So all of those concerns that Paul has been having, all of those moments where he looks at the enemy and precisely sees human beings, in a really weird way becomes the destructive force that is actually his undoing in this chapter. Because he sees the French citizens and goes, behind the lines they're human too, they won't hurt their own people. He's not necessarily thinking, in order to win this war, they will do what they need to. Because he's having a hard time thinking like that. And he's facing other people. He's not facing down innocent German citizens who are stuck behind enemy lines. But it's that idea. We know full well he went back home, and he met a lot of people who assumed that the young warriors were willing to sacrifice themselves to win this war. Your head can very easily say, those people over there are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to win this war. Because you're not looking at them fleeing in terror. This book constantly surprises me with just how much it picks at the worst of human nature. And then how careful it is to pull that back. Because the rest of the chapter, for the most part, is this companionship between the wounded soldiers. Like, Paul goes to extreme lengths to make sure he and Krompt stay together. He loses cigars doing it, bribing the soldier. He prevents himself from actually getting home quicker by faking a fever so he gets put off the train at the same place that Krompt does. They're willing to anger a bunch of Catholic nuns who are taking care of them to try and make it easier on each other. And then there is this moment at the end where they all act like this soldier and his wife are not having sex in the same room, having discussed this plan in advance. Because we're given this moment during the bombardment where human life of any type suddenly doesn't matter. And then Eric draws it back and says, but you can't live like that. You can't live with this mentality that everybody else can be destroyed as long as I survive, as long as I win, as long as my side wins. Because then you end up on this hospital train, and in this hospital, watching these people die, people who have friends and family. Like, this finishing up with the soldier and his wife is this lighthearted, raunchy moment, for sure. And we see that throughout All Quiet on the Western Front. But it is precisely this relationship being then extended beyond those who fought in the trenches with you. It is Paul recognizing in this moment, and Eric highlighting in this moment, the extension away from that us versus men narrowing. It is precisely the wife coming in with the baby and that meaning something. And the soldiers finding a connection with her and her husband. They all end up calling her mother at the end. They connect with this absolute stranger who has not been what they've been through. And it gives you a hint that that is still possible, even with everything else in this chapter saying it's not worth it. There's still connections that are possible because they need to be possible. What can Krompt look forward to after the war if he loses the friends who fought beside him and his leg? And when Germany loses the war, that is there too. What has his suffering all come to that he full well is considering shooting himself over living as a cripple. Those relationships after the war need to be there, or we will all despair. And Remarque is trying to give them to us while still being extremely honest about how war works. And we're almost done. We have 2 chapters left. The last one is extremely short. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.